Putin is really the ultimate power animal in a way, that he's not an ideologue. He, of course, he's very corrupt and he's a kleptocrat, but he's not about money either. It's really about power in the most traditional sense of things. And from that point of view, I think even if he miscalculated what would happen with the invasion of Ukraine, he thought he could impose his order over Ukraine, and he has obviously been unable to do this. If you can't impose your order, you might be strong enough to impose chaos. And this is what he is planning to do both in Ukraine and overall in the West, while restoring a tighter, maybe poorer and more limited, but tighter order internally, and consolidating his power internally.
But now to a work of political fiction that reads like a thriller about the rise to power of Vladimir Putin's notorious spin doctor. The novel's key figure, Vadim Baranov, is based on Vladislav Surkov, who is dubbed Putin's Rasputin. The Wizard of the Kremlin is published in the UK on Thursday, but it's already an international prize-winning best-selling novel in France. Its author, Giuliano da Empoli, is a political scientist who is senior advisor to an Italian Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, and off the back of this novel has been called in by senior European politicians to give insights on the Kremlin's mindset. Giuliano da Empoli, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you.
A real pleasure to have you on. Tell me about the novel's protagonist then, Vadim Baranov, first, before we come on to his real-life counterpart.
Yes, well, he's a pretty unusual character because you have to imagine Putin's entourage is made up mostly of gray men from the intelligence and military or dodgy businessmen. And in the middle of this group, you have a guy who studied drama at school and then goes on and writes novels under a pseudonym and lyrics for rock anthems and has pictures of U.S. rappers on the walls of his office. But he basically becomes PR and a chief propagandist for the Kremlin, and he seems to consider his work almost as a contemporary art performance. So he's a pretty effective manipulator, but at the same time he interprets his job almost as if it was an artistic project.
And look, as a political scientist, why did you decide that the best way to spread this message, to tell this story, was as a novel, rather than as a biography or as a non-fiction book?
Well, I did research the book as if I had to write a non-fiction book. I guess I would have been able to write a biography of the real character on which my fictional character is based. But when you write non-fiction, there's a limit. You have to stop outside people's head. You can't get into their head. And what I wanted to do was to get into this character's head, and the only way to do that is through fiction. So that's why I also, in the end, even if my main character is based on a real character, and all the events, the political and historical events in my book are real, I did create a completely fictional character out of him.
And how similar are the two characters? How closely does Baranov map onto the real-life figure of Vladislav Surkov, Putin's spin doctor?
Well, I would say his profile is similar. Even some details of his biography and of his actions are similar, but then he has a completely different family history. The real Surkov had a Chechen father. My character has a completely different family history, different personal history, and even his actions in terms of what he does politically and as a building this sort of postmodern theater for the Tsar, for Putin. All the actions are real, but since it's a fictional character, I could turn him into a sort of a super Putin spin doctor. He does some stuff that Surkov actually did, but then other things that other people around Putin have done. So, for example, the Sochi Olympics, or the internet, the troll factory around in St. Petersburg, or stuff like that Surkov didn't really do, but that others around Putin have done in reality.
Tell us about the real Surkov then, and like where he came from and what his influence is.
Well, what's interesting about Surkov, I think, is that he's one of these characters. He's really immersed in Western pop culture, mostly American pop culture, I would say. This is another difference with my character, who has a more classical, even French and European background. But both characters have in common this fact that they know Western culture, Western European culture very well, but they use this knowledge against it in a way. That's why they're so effective in terms of disinformation and manipulation and all that, because they know us so well. And this is a bit the tragic arc, both, I think, of the real Surkov and of the fictional Baranov. It's that somehow they put their Western culture at the service of a project that goes in a completely opposite direction. And in the end, they are themselves cut out from Europe, because they're sanctioned and they can't even set foot in Europe and in the West anymore. And yeah, this is something that I think is one of the important features of Surkov, besides being a very cynical puppet master in so many ways.
What's his approach to truth? Because when we talk about propaganda, sometimes what we're talking about is the beneficial spreading of a message, perhaps with a slight angle or push put on it, and sometimes we're talking about just sort of outright falsehoods that are spread for political advantage. He's more in the latter camp, right?
Yeah, I would say, he doesn't. And the point is, I think. Truth for him is everything that will generate and resonate with some kind of emotion. So it's not about factual truth, it's about emotional truth. So that's why he's more like a novelist or a theater director, because he's not looking for factual truth, he's looking for narrative and emotional truth. And this is what most propagandists actually do, as you know, in politics. I mean, that tends to be the what happens. But of course, and this is another feature of Surkov. He uses all the tools that you have at your disposal today to build parallel realities and different information bubbles. And this is also his usefulness to Putin, because Putin is somehow a pre-modern leader. He's barely been on the internet. He's never been on social media. He's really pre-modern in so many ways. And characters like Surkov are adding this kind of postmodern theatrics to the very traditional model of leadership that Putin has restored in Russia.
It's fascinating to go from pre-modern to postmodern without the period of actually being modern in the middle, which that seems to be
exactly.
Seems
that's the part that's lacking is modern.
You were invited by Elizabeth Borne, the Prime Minister of France, who resigned last week, and her counterpart in Denmark and the President of Switzerland, to share your insights on Putin and Russia, which is remarkable that a piece of fiction can have that sort of impact over foreign policy without betraying any confidences. What sort of thing were they interested in?
Well, I think fiction doesn't replace nonfiction or an essay or a geopolitical essay. It's just a different entrance door into a possible reality. So again, it's not so much about factuality as much as about feelings and emotions and impressions and all that, and that's also why I think I was able to write this book, because I'm not a specialist on Russia, but I am kind of a specialist on political communication and power negotiations and all that. And this is what they were interested in. I mean, more, I would say, kind of a psychological assessment of what is going on and what the atmosphere might be inside the Kremlin today and all that.
From that perspective, as a, if the book is a guide to understanding the mindset of the Kremlin, what can that tell us about how, like, the ongoing sort of Russian war in Ukraine, for example? What through that prism, how should we understand what's happening there from Putin's perspective and indeed from other Russian perspectives?
Well, I think war in Ukraine was obviously, my book was actually written before the start of the war, so I wasn't planning on exploiting that, but it was based on this idea that Putin is really the ultimate power animal in a way, that he's not an ideologue. He, of course, is he's very corrupt and he's a kleptocrat, but he's not about money either. It's really about power in the most traditional sense of things. And from that point of view, I think even if he miscalculated what would happen with the invasion of Ukraine, he thought he could impose his order over Ukraine, and he has obviously been unable to do this. If you can't impose your order, you might be strong enough to impose chaos. And this is what he is planning to do in both in Ukraine and overall in the West, while restoring a tighter, maybe poorer and more limited, but by tighter order internally, and consolidating his power internally. And this, so even if the Ukraine invasion for now hasn't been a very successful endeavor for him, I think this is what is going on now, and he might still succeed at it.
Sure. Okay. Look, you were a senior advisor to the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, as I said at the start. I'm interested to know, what do you make now of Italy under the current Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who's a sort of right-wing populist politician? Are there any lessons there from your book about what Italy's going through at the moment?
Well, Meloni is trying to assert herself as a sort of competent national populist. You have two types of national populists in the West today. You have the kind of like more unhinged figures like Trump and Bolsonaro and others, and then you have the more rational kind of in a way capable figures, when people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and people like that. And I think Meloni is trying to go that way, of course, while operating in the Italian context, which has its own specificities. I think the lessons from my book when it comes to Meloni is that, that's what's interesting about Russia when you look at it from a Western point of view, that some things are very familiar and some things are completely and very different from our dynamics. And what is familiar is that in times of chaos and in times of great turmoil, like the ones that Russia lived in the 90s, figures that will come forward and step forward and restore a form of traditional authority and nation and roots and all that they tend to have an audience because, of course, and Putin did this in a very brutal way at the end of the 90s. And other people like Meloni are trying to do the same, of course, in more democratic, less violent, less brutal ways in the West. But in a way, it's a not so different, not so different.
Yeah, understood. Look, Giuliano da Empoli, thank you very much indeed. A completely fascinating conversation.